I can't tell you folks how many years I've known our speaker today. I think the first time I met him, it was in my early years as mayor. But anyway, he said he doesn't want a big introduction because he doesn't want to be built up so that your expectations are too high. But he's got some interesting stuff here, so I'm going to give you the basics of it. He grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He has degrees in economics from Roosevelt University in Chicago, Washington University in St. Louis, and the University of California in Los Angeles. And Morton, I only had to take economics for one semester in high school. You had to study an awful lot to learn what you know.
Yes, I did.
Hope you can teach us something.
I didn't get through the first semester very well at all, and the repeats were just tedious.
It's not time for you to talk yet.
Excuse me.
He taught economics for 33 years at Indiana University, and he advised six Indiana governors, both Republican and Democrat, on taxation and economic development since 1970. And he says that they didn't take his advice, so that must be why we're in the state we're in. He was a consultant to the Economic Development Corporation, and he says that was until he was dismissed for being sensible. And I was on the Economic Development Corporation at that time, and I don't remember him being sensible, but he was the governor's liaison to the U.S. Bureau of Census from 1979 to 2003. He's testified in Congress and his PBS NewsHour. He writes a weekly column called Eye on the Pie, which is in the Goshen News, along with a number of other Indiana newspapers. His themes are economic development, the role of government, and citizen involvement as consumers and voters. Now, I'll tell you, he's known to use allegories, parody, and a little bit of sarcasm. And so his columns make you think. And he's also a bit acerbic. He doesn't care who he offends with his forthrightness. As an example, my first opportunity to meet him, he told us mayors that we were spineless because we wouldn't run for the legislature and straighten it out. And I didn't like being called spineless, but he's probably right. We were spineless. He wrote a book called Tightrope to Tomorrow, which he says includes cartoons to make it understandable to elected officials. Lives in Indianapolis with his wife, Rebecca. He has 3 children, 6 grandchildren, 3 old cats, a psychotic dog named Nervous Fergus, and a large dog who eats everything, I presume everything except Nervous Fergus. He doesn't eat Nervous Fergus.
That's true.
So I consider Morton Marcus a friend, and even though I was initially offended, I got over that. And I want you to help me welcome Morton Marcus to our Zoom tonight.
Thank you.
Now it's time for you to talk.
Okay. Let's see, I seem to suddenly be blinded here. I'd like to talk to you about the basics of the Elkhart economy, so as a preview of talking about Biden's program, because I don't really think that unless we have a common base as to what we believe Elkhart to be, when I say Elkhart, I mean the county, I think it'd be very helpful if we sort of shared the same ideas. Let me see if this is going to work. So I put my email address there so that if you want to send me any kind of note, you can do that. These data are all for 2019. You say, well, why are they so old? One is that we don't have 2020 yet. And the second is that 2020, it's not the kind of year that's going to allow us to have a real feel for what was actually going on. The data will not reveal the activities. As you look at it, about just under $5 of every $100 of Indiana's gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product, as you recall, is the value of, is there some way we can also get some pictures here? I don't know. Is the value of all the goods and services produced in the economy. So for every $100 that Indiana produces, $4.69 could be said to be coming from Elkhart County, 5% of the state, and that's really not a bad number when you consider that Elkhart County has only 4.3% of the state's population, which means that Elkhart County really is overproducing, or as I would really like to say, other parts of the state are underperforming on a sort of per capita basis. The average annual wage in Elkhart County, and remember this is an average, and averages are strange numbers, but this is an average. It's about $50,000 per job in the county in 2019, but you have to add into that what the employer contributes to government and private insurance. And that brings the average wage bill for the employer up to $61,800. Now, very, very few employers actually reveal to their workers how much they're paying out to have that worker on the payroll. And I think that's a number that employers have to make known to people. The average proprietor in Elkhart County makes about $48,000. What this tells me is that, well, it depends on what your view is of proprietors. Some people view people who go into business for themselves, or people who run the barber shop, or the people who have the beauty parlor, or the people who own a small business, that they're somehow the backbone of the country. And it just tells me that the backbone doesn't get paid as well as the ribs. The average annual wage, exclusive of the government and private insurance contributions, is above what the proprietors are making. So the proprietors must be getting something else. And part of it, I believe, is some of the tax benefits that an ordinary employee doesn't get.
Reds are in there, but just pull them out. They should be dry.
Oh, really? Are these statistics wet? I didn't know that. Okay. Gross domestic product is the value of all goods and services in Elkhart County. It's $16.2 billion a year. Now, that's a very hard number for people to grasp. You think of your county and you say to yourself, we produce $16.2 billion worth of goods. That's an amazing number. We don't have any idea of the magnitudes that our economies are. Indiana, as you can see, is 379, called $380 billion economy. And the nation is 21.4 trillion. So I have to ask, Mr. Biden is talking about, President Biden is talking about a $1.9 trillion program. And that's what? That's in the neighborhood under 10% stimulus to the entire economy. It's a large figure, it's a large percentage, but still you have to look at it in the context of the magnitude of the economy. My feeling is that we don't do that. What we do is we compare that to government spending in general. We compare it to the debt that will be added to the debt of the United States. But really, the important thing is, how much of a stimulus is it? Well, it's just under 10%. Let me move on, and feel free to interrupt, by the way. I can roll too easily. Looking at Elkhart County's earnings from work. Remember that Elkhart County had an output worth $16.2 billion. Well, Elkhart County wages and salaries plus benefits that we just looked at, it's about $8.7 billion. That's 53% of GDP. Now, I've been moving too fast for you to get the impact of that, but that says that labor's share of the output of the county is just over 50%. And that becomes one of the questions that we have in our society is, what share should labor, and labor means everybody who works, whether they own the business or work for somebody else, what percent of the business of the output should they be receiving? Some of this money goes as taxes back to government. Some of the money of that 16 billion is going back to, is going 16 trillion, excuse me, is going back to, no, that's millions. It's easy to get tricked up on this, but it's going back to pay taxes. Some of it's going to pay capital also. And what's happening in the United States is we are seeing more and more capital invested, and this 53% is basically a shrinking number. Elkhart County happens to be on the high side. Many counties in the United States are much lower. They're now down under 50%. If we subtract from that the dollars that are leaving the county on a daily basis, that come up on an annual basis as 19% of the wages that are being paid, almost 20% of the wages that are being paid are leaving the county. You have a tremendous outflow of money. You have a tremendous inflow of people coming in from elsewhere to work in Elkhart County. And as with all assets, they are also liabilities. They are part of the congestion that you have. They are part of just a tremendous flow. Again, 1 out of every $5 that is being earned in the county is leaving the county. And I don't think that there's very much attention to that in the policy thinking of people in Elkhart County. The inflow, which is very reasonable to expect an inflow, well, the inflow is tiny in comparison. The inflow is only 1/4, 27% of the size of the outflow. And what this ends up doing, if you add in now the proprietor's income of a billion, that you end up that the total down here, this 8.5, compared to the 8.6 or 7 up here, that's equal to all of this money in here. All the commuting money and all of the proprietor's income is less than the difference between the wages and salaries that are earned by people who are working in the county and the income of the workers when they're home, because they're bringing money in, but so much money is leaving. And I think that that's a matter of concern. There are very few people who really take any interest in this. They talk about, oh, we're losing jobs to Mexico. We're losing jobs to other places. But we never think about the fact that the people who are working here could be living here. And that each one of them, as they leave the county, are taking with them money that could be spent locally. We don't see a connection between employment and housing. And very often there's a hostility that builds up between the people who are coming in. Some of us don't like the people who are coming in to work in our county. Well, I don't know if that's a problem that you have in your county, but you certainly have an awful lot of people coming in, and it's a very unbalanced situation. Okay, we're going to talk about $1,400 now per person in Elkhart County. That's one of the proposals. I don't think it's changed yet, but there's a lot of talk about limiting it in some way. Well, how many people do we have in Elkhart County? In 2019, we had over 206,000 people. That would translate into about $289 million to come in. Again, how do we think in terms of the magnitude of $289 million? Well, the answer is how many Whoppers would that buy from Burger King? Burger King is currently offering two Whoppers for $5. And that means there's enough for everybody with still $287 million left over. The real question is, where are you going to spend your $287 million? When are you going to spend it? And on what are you going to spend it? If you want to talk about what's going to be the impact on Elkhart County, you have to be able to answer these questions. You have to be able to know whether or not, first of all, you're going to spend it or whether you're going to save it. And one of the ways of saving it, of course, is to pay down an existing loan. I know that if I were to get a check tomorrow of $1,400, I'd go and reduce my car loan. Is that spending? No, I spent it a long time ago, but I would reduce the liability that I have. When am I going to do it? Well, I'd do it in the morning. But I think that a lot of people are going to hold on to money for some extended period of time, not knowing whether or not they're going to get that job back. $1,400 doesn't seem like a lot of money when you're comfortable. I've heard from many people. Gordon and I belong to a web network of crazy people, and I've heard from many of them who say, I don't need any money from the federal government. I've got Social Security and I've got a small pension, and that's really enough for me. Well, that's not an uncommon feeling. That there are people out there who are in greater need than many, many retired people. Not that there aren't poor retired people, but there are many comfortable retired people as a result of Social Security and the pension programs that have been built up, particularly in states like Indiana, where at one time the unions were very strong. So when you're going to spend it and on what you're going to spend it is going to have a great deal of impact on Elkhart County. My belief is that the amount that would necessarily be spent on Elkhart County in terms of retail trade is relatively small, because when you think of people making not just the routine purchases of every day, but the purchases of every week and every month, they're much more inclined to be going out to Costco, and they'll be going to Target, and they'll be going to many places that don't have stores in Elkhart County, but they're over there in St. Joseph County. And some of you, of course, may be really adventurous and go as far as Michigan City. You're going to spend it on back rent, other bills, or new TV, or new teeth, or maybe it's time to get a divorce. That's expensive, but $1,400 a person might be a good start for a couple. $2,800, they can probably find an attorney or two. Well, will the Biden stimulus cause inflation? And the first question I have to ask is, what's inflation? If we were in a classroom situation, I'd point to someone and say, what is inflation? And I can't do that at this time. In fact, I can't see your names even. So I'm going to have to just fudge it and say, Gordon, are you still with us? Did he get silenced? Hello?
There, I'm unmuted now.
Okay,
With you.
good. So what is inflation, Gordon?
Inflation is where the value of money goes down so that you have to pay more for the things that you buy.
Exactly. And it's all across the board. It isn't just one thing or another. You know, the price of gasoline's a little bit higher today than it was 2 weeks ago. It isn't just one thing, but it's across the board, right? And so we come then to the question of what causes inflation, and people have all sorts of different ideas. Many people are inclined to believe that inflation is caused by labor unions. This was a very popular idea 30 and 40 years ago, because unions were asking for more money, and now unions are just asking to hold on to their jobs. And so labor unions, other people say, no, it's big business. There's just this tremendous drive for profits. And of course, there are the economists who love to argue that, no, inflation is just money. And when you have a lot of money floating around in the economy, then prices will go up. Well, that was the standard view that economists had for a long, long time. You're off the hook now, by the way, Gordon. I'm not going to be calling on you anymore. I'll find somebody else to pick on. The view of that inflation is caused by money has been contested by a group of economists who have proposed what's called modern monetary theory. MMT is what the abbreviation is. And their argument is that as long as there are idle resources, as long as we've got unemployment, as long as we have factories that are not at capacity, as long as we have vacant retail space, as long as we have large inventories, all of those things, you can have more money in the economy and it will not cause prices to go up. There are a lot of articles coming out just in the last 2 or 3 weeks that I've seen that are saying there are economists who are concerned about inflation. Of course, there are economists who are concerned about inflation. They have to be concerned about something. When the reporter calls up and says, "What are you concerned about?" They'll tell you. They're not concerned for some reason about the people who don't have money to pay their rent. They don't talk so much about the people who are putting off the decision of what kind of medical care they're going to get that's not covered by insurance. A lot of people do not have dental insurance or eye insurance and all sorts of other problems which their inflation, their insurance may not cover. These are the things that are the problems of tremendous amount of unemployment. And I was very interested to see that the head of the Federal Reserve System just a few days ago, Mr. Powell, in talking to, I believe he was talking to Congress, but he made the point that the unemployment statistics that we normally look at understate unemployment because it fails to take account of all of the people who've just sort of dropped out of the labor market. Many of these people said, well, I'm going to retire now. They're at around the age of retirement, but they're not necessarily at the age of retirement, whatever that age might be. And when they found that they were going to be laid off, they didn't want to look at it that way. They didn't want to say that they were unemployed. They didn't want to go downtown and file for unemployment compensation. They feel that somehow they're too proud to do that. They'd rather define themselves as being retired. Well, they could easily, and many of them would very willingly go back to work if they could get into a job very similar to the one that they had. But the one that they had may not be there as this whole thing goes on. And now it's over a year that this has been going on. And we are in a situation with our economy that is a very serious one and that is underplayed very often by our statistics. So I'm glad to see that Mr. Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, is very conscious of the unemployment situation and supportive of the stimulus, because he doesn't feel it will cause inflation because we have so many underutilized resources. All you have to do is drive around and look at the number of stores that are for rent or buildings that are for lease, and you will have a great measure of underutilized resources. Well, I have to ask, did the first Trump stimulus cause inflation? That's the one that we began to see checks, when was it, in April or May or June that the checks came out? And I know some of you didn't get the checks, or your children didn't get the checks. But did this Trump stimulus cause inflation? The answer is no. And the reason it didn't, again, is because we had idle resources. Will the second Trump stimulus cause inflation? That's the one that has gone through Congress. I put the name Trump on it just because it marks a period of time. Mr. Trump didn't have that much to do with it, but the second one doesn't seem to have had any effect on inflation. We have seen a little bit of inflation in certain commodities, largely because there is a lot of money that is still out there. Although we can talk about the hardship of some parts of our population, there are other parts of the population that are in absolutely fine condition. And what they're doing is they're going out and they're buying new houses and causing the price of lumber to go up, because building construction for homes is very strong. Home prices are very strong in many communities. You've seen it in Elkhart. you've seen it with the RV industry, which has had a tremendous year in 2019. Hardly what, in 2020, hardly what we would have expected of if they had really been suffering from any kind of recession. The RV became an alternative to taking a cruise. Carnival lines shut down, but the lines that produced the RVs didn't shut down because large numbers of people went out and bought RVs as an alternative to taking a cruise. So then the question becomes, will the Biden stimulus cause inflation? And again, as I said, there are a lot of articles that are out there right now that people are talking about, saying that we've got a real problem because people are going to be suddenly going out and spending a lot of money. Well, I don't see restaurant prices necessarily rising very much as a result of this. Think about the restaurant that has been closed for a while. Their employees aren't going to come back demanding a lot more money than they were getting in the past. They're going to be happy to get what they got in the past. Customers are going to be coming in, and they will not want to see sticker shock on their menus. They're not going to want to see the idea that suddenly the business is going to try to make up what they couldn't make up in the past, what they couldn't bring in the past. I think that the likelihood of inflation is relatively small, and the inflation that we may have is probably going to be fairly short-lived. That's all supposition. There's no way of proving that one way or another until we actually see the data. About other features of the Biden package. Well, assistance to cities and towns. I think that Alan can speak very well to the problems that cities and towns have right now when tax receipts are down, when we're going to start to see assessments falling. Remember that assessments are always behind the times. The effect on revenue is always lagged. But cities and towns have had to keep paying their firemen, and they've had to keep paying the police, and they've had to keep the entire functions of the water department and the sewers and all of the other things, keep the roads clear of snow. Those things are continuing to go on, and we have to expect that those cities and towns are in very, very bad condition. And it's not just the biggest cities in the United States. It's not just Chicago and New York and the others that get talked about a lot, but it's virtually every city and town has very limited amounts of cash, and they've had to cut back on services in many cases. And the idea of assistance to cities and towns makes sense. Would that be inflationary? I don't think so. I don't think that there's going to be a major shortage of fire and police operatives because they've been there all the time. The question is making up for the debt that many cities and towns have had to assume. The minimum wage is another issue. The minimum wage of $15 an hour. I was looking this up the other day, and I found out that the year I was born, the minimum wage was 25 cents. That today would be about $4.70, $4.80, something like that. So it wasn't very much to live on then, and it's not very much to live on now. The minimum wage has always lagged behind the real needs of people. And a minimum wage of $15 an hour says, at best, something like $30,000 a year. It's hard to imagine an individual living on $30,000 a year. Two of them can live together if they've got $60,000 a year, but a single mother who's supporting children at $30,000 a year is in real serious trouble. So I don't think that that's going to be a problem for inflation either. Infrastructure spending. I love infrastructure because I always have to ask this question. What's infrastructure? Most of us think of infrastructure and we think roads, bridges, and sewers. Now we add the internet. That's what we've got as infrastructure. But then you can go further and you can add schools and hospitals and other kinds of social necessities that are really in bad shape. And we've seen it with many hospitals, how it's not just the COVID-19 that's been causing them to be running at capacity, but many of them are really not properly equipped to handle large numbers of people and emergency situations. The United States doesn't expect terrible things to happen, and yet they do all the time. We will have a tornado here and a hurricane there. We have this tremendous snowstorm that can move across the country in very short periods of time. And the needs for emergency moved away from downtown has, I think it's over near where they've moved away from downtown. I think that if something were to happen at a high school football game or a baseball game or any kind of event, and these high schools are not necessarily on the periphery of the community near the hospitals, but you could have a major catastrophe. And we just never plan for emergencies. That's part of infrastructure. Transit systems. You're fortunate that your two major cities work together to have a transit system that ties them together. It's far from what it might be in terms of its services, but it's a semblance of what you might wish for in a transit system. But in this country, again, we are not willing to invest in transit systems. We're willing to invest in roads and bridges, but we're not willing to invest in transit systems. I don't have it on the list here, but airports are the same thing. There are 67 airports in the state of Indiana that are in real need of modernization. And you heard today about United Airlines buying flying taxis. Well, they will be heavy users of these small airports as we move forward. What about museums, theaters, and orchestras? These are part of the infrastructure of the community. They're part of the arts, the culture, what you might even think of as the soul of a community is the way in which people can visit with others in their own community who are providing entertainment. It's a very different kind of community where you have to get all your entertainment over television, where you can't go out to a concert. I was always impressed at Newcastle, which is a small town that's had a lot of economic difficulties when the Chrysler Corporation left. Newcastle built a performance stage right downtown so that they would be able to have concerts downtown. Now that to me is an intelligent investment because they're trying to do something that says this is a place that's worth living in. Well, what do we get? Foreign aid just bounced in up there. You say, well, foreign aid isn't mentioned in Biden's package. Well, I don't know why it isn't, because it seems to me that one of the most successful economic programs that the United States ever had was the Marshall Plan. After World War II, we made available to the nations in Europe, which had been destroyed by the Nazi onslaught by the Second World War, we made available to them tremendous amounts of money, which they could use to buy the things that they needed. And what did they need? They needed US-made tractors, US-made materials to first tear down their war-torn buildings, tear down the rubble that existed in many of their cities for the benefit of people in Europe and for the people in the United States. And it's one of the reasons that so many people see the era of the 1950s as a great era for America, was because we were rebuilding Europe at the same time that we were building so much in the United States. Worker training. This is part of of almost every spending program that any administration comes up with, it's never been really successful. And a large part of it is because you really can't train workers aside from them being at the place of work with the people they're going to work with. And we try to do worker training in classrooms, and it doesn't work. We try to do it in laboratories or in workshops in facilities like Ivy Tech or even in our high schools, and it doesn't work. Workers have to be trained by the people they're going to work with. And that means getting employers to be willing to pay people who are in training. And we don't have very much of that at all. But a government program could pay the wages, not just as trainees, but pay the workers full employment wages while they're learning. It's got all sorts of shortcomings. I know it's you can imagine the way people might misuse it, but it might be the best way of getting people into work situations where they can be trained for the jobs that they're actually going to have. The child tax credit is one that's being talked about quite a bit. The idea would be to give $3,600 to children up to the age of 6, as I recall, and then up to the age of 17, it would be $3,000 a piece. Of course, the money wouldn't go to the children, it would go to their parents. That's a very nice sum of money. It would be paid out in monthly installments by the Internal Revenue Service, and they talk about starting that July 1 of this year, 2021. I would suspect that we'd be very fortunate to have that go through. It's a large amount of money. If my memory is correct, it's in the neighborhood of $17 billion. But in terms of being able to help them pay for childcare so that they can have maybe 2 workers going to work, which is becoming the norm on intact families. Oh, that's 6 and 17. Environmental protection is another area where the president has indicated a very great interest in seeing something done, but I don't believe that there's much of an environmental program currently in the Biden package. Mental health training and treatment comes up all the time whenever there's a tragedy of a school shooting or other incidents of that sort, and yet the money isn't there. The knowledge of how to deal with the kinds of problems that people have who are inclined to use violent methods to right the wrongs that they feel, that knowledge isn't there. The treatment techniques are not well known, and yet we haven't put much money into it. So these are other things that I think could be in the package, and some of them might be. What would their effect be specifically on Elkhart County? Only to the extent that each one of them has bearing on different aspects of the economy of Elkhart County. Would jobs be lost at Burger Chef or other firms that are operating in Elkhart County? Undoubtedly, but at the same time, there would be a lot of adjustments made by a lot of different companies about how to deal with the higher wages that they're going to be paying. Could Goshen, Elkhart, Nappanee, and other towns use more money? Without question. So the question, however, is, would the money be forthcoming? And we don't know that until the Congress actually passes the bills. Are there roads, bridges, sewers, internet connections that need to be improved in Elkhart County? Absolutely. But will the money be forthcoming, or will it go through the state and then the state will make the decisions instead of the government of Elkhart County?
I was interested in, the only reason I look like I'm not engaged because I have a cold. I just was really interested about the wages leaving the county. I just I never thought of that before, and what an impact that is on the county. And you were saying, do we like that or not? We can't be an inclusive people if we don't like it. Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know the answer either, but it is the kind of thing that we don't think about, and yet it is of a great magnitude. I'm not saying that employers should go around saying you must live in the county if you're going to work here. But the point is, are there people who would like to live in Elkhart County who are not living there because the kind of housing they can afford is not available to them? Or are there social conditions where there are people who are coming into work? I know that there are people who are working in Logansport who travel every day from Fort Wayne. They're Burmese, and they live in Fort Wayne because there's a significant Burmese population there. Many of them would like to have a larger Burmese population in Logansport, so they could work there, or they'd like to have a better job in Fort Wayne than meatpacking. And we need to know more about our workforce, and we just don't know that. And that's why I like bringing it up, and I'm glad that you found it of interest.
Morton, I think
Yes, Alan.
part of the reason for the influx of workers and people who don't live here is not just the lack of affordable housing, but a lack of housing in general. I mean, we don't have the really nice subdivisions like Granger's got, so some executives live there. There were a lot of apartments built out on US 33 where our Holiday Inn used to be, and market rate apartments. They were going to rent from $1,000 to $1,600 a month. I didn't think there was any way that they were going to fill those up quickly. They were going to build them in 2 phases. Well, they ended up building them in 1 phase because they got gobbled up right away by people coming in who could afford to pay over $1,000 for rent. So it's a lack of housing across the board, which causes our even substandard houses to rent for too much. Goshen Community Schools, I'm on the school board now. Goshen Community Schools loses some students to Elkhart because our rents are higher in Goshen than they are in Elkhart, and they live in Goshen. So there's a lot of stuff tied together when it comes to inflow and outflow of labor.
Yes, there are. And the other thing is that when you have 2 workers in a family, very often they're going in different directions. Mm-hmm. And so where they choose to live, the statistics tell us, are generally closer to where the female works than where the male works. Now, that may be because we're in such a terribly sexist society, but I can think of other reasons as well. Excuse me?
I have a separate question.
Sure.
All of this stimulus is raising the national debt considerably. What's going to happen with that? What's the significance of it?
That's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? Nothing. That the whole business about the national debt may mean nothing. You know, as I understand it, in Britain, they are still paying off the Napoleonic Wars. Now, that's before either you or I were born. You know that? And it doesn't really matter, because the national debt, what is one person's debt is another person's asset. And the national debt is basically a form of money that people have. It bears a low rate of interest, but it's not a 0 rate of interest yet. And as such, it's a secure way of holding money that you want to have access to almost immediately. And that's very, very important for large numbers of people who have lots of money. You and I don't have to worry about these things. Now, the issue is that we have politicians who don't seem to understand that. And that's one of the things that the people who are preaching this modern monetary theory I've been trying to get across is that the debt is basically a phony issue. Now, that doesn't mean that all debt is a phony issue. Certainly your debt or my debt isn't a phony issue. The debt of certain countries where they have poor economic conditions may be very serious. When Greece was having so much difficulty with their debt, and many other countries that have poor economies have trouble with too much debt, because they don't have the ability to pay it back. But there's a lot of I don't know, you want to call it, think that the government, the national government, not the state government or the city government, but the national government is endangered just the way a household would be endangered. The difficulty that I have is when people say, well, look at what happened with Germany after the First World War, when Germany just printed money, and the inflation just skyrocketed. Terrible, terrible situation. But that's because Germany had to pay back reparations to France and to other countries, and they didn't have the productive capacity. And because they didn't have the productive capacity, if you print the money and there's no productive capacity to absorb it, you're going to see prices go up. And that's exactly what happened in Germany. That's what my concern is. Is the United States so international today that maybe we aren't as safe as this modern monetary theory says we are? But the chances are that they're right. We have never seen a situation where a country as secure as the United States has been threatened by too much money. Britain at its high point never had these kinds of problems. The issue again is the unexpected. Britain didn't expect to have a Second World War right on top of the First World War. And the reason the British economy collapsed was because of so many people had been killed in the First World War, and so many died in the Second World War, and there was a lot of destruction. War is the great enemy of economies. So I'm not going to worry about it, Gordon, and you can go to sleep tonight and not worry about it too.
Morton, it's
Yes.
Chad Crabtree. I know you
Yes.
talked about
What happened to your other meeting, Jack?
it got bumped, so I'm here for the duration, which is nice.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful.
You talked about public transportation and
Yeah.
that wasn't really going anywhere. Well, with President Biden, he's a big Amtrak supporter, rode the Amtrak every day to and from
Right.
Delaware. And now with Secretary Buttigieg, former mayor of South Bend,
Right. Yes.
transportation secretary, how do you think that will play into the economy with them putting hopefully an importance, which it seems to be, on public transportation and quite possibly high-speed rail?
Well, high-speed rail is not public transportation because high-speed rail between Mishawaka and South Bend would be, and it's gone. So there's no point in talking about that. The issue is that we need to put a lot more money into testing and into standardization. The companies that are developing the electric vehicles, for example, have yet to find a common platform. One of the things that we developed over time, and it took at least a decade, was for Ford and General Motors and the Dodge brothers to get together on a fairly common platform. Yes, there were differences, but basically, when Kettering developed the electric starter for your car, and you didn't have to get out and grind it, that was a major step forward, and it applied to every vehicle that was being made. Those are the kinds of things that we need. We also need to have just a common base on how the computers are going to interact with each other. it's wonderful if the Google cars can all get together and you know, and have a party, but we can't afford to have the Google cars not necessarily dealing well with the Apple cars, and we still have that problem with our cell phones. You know, people who are on an iPhone have difficulty transferring to a Samsung phone. So there are those kinds of things. You go to any kind of technology, the typewriter, until we all accepted the same keyboard, the typewriters really couldn't move places. So standardization is important. And that is a really function that is difficult to do in a very competitive society. So that's where Biden and Buttigieg, I think, can have tremendous influence, is by putting out the money that would help these companies or induce them into cooperative agreements on standards. Critics will say, well, you're stifling competition, you're stifling innovation, and that's part of the price of standardization. But it didn't seem to hurt the automobiles too much in their development than to the industry. So I think that that's really where we need a lot of work being done. The other thing is our cities aren't ready for this. Our highways aren't ready for it. You know, my father had a safety routine. As he was driving through the streets of Brooklyn, he would be driving along a street where there are a lot of cross streets that had stop signs. He honked at every car that was sitting at a stop sign because that was his way of being sure that they knew he was coming. I think that we get into a situation where we have to have our cities being much more prepared for the interactions that today we take care of as drivers, and which are very complex. And the companies know all these things. It's just, again, a question of time and money and research and developing the programs that are necessary. I've been disappointed in the state of Indiana in not putting more money into automotive research. I know this is going to sound partisan, but Purdue has failed us once again. I don't see them doing the job that we need done with transportation. I've seen it with the aircraft industry. They have not done the job on helping our airports. You know, they've got county extension agents for everything. I mean, you want to grow asparagus, you can go to the county extension agent, but the airport really doesn't have much in the way of technical support. And these are the kinds of concerns I have at the highest levels in our government. And this goes back to basically Whitcomb's administration. When I first came to Indiana, there doesn't seem to be very much interest at all in the Department of Transportation about aviation. And I think that aviation is where we have to spend an awful lot of our money on developing a situation where these air taxis, as they could be called, are really important to get us from one place to another. I don't know if you've ever tried to go from Goshen or Elkhart to Kearney, Nebraska, but I had to go from Bloomington to Kearney, Nebraska. And it involved a series of flights. There's only 2 flights a day into Kearney, and then those same 2 leave. And so there's a scheduling problem. And it's just, it's a mess. How do we keep smaller communities alive in an era? We've got Zoom now, you know, and you're in Elkhart County. I happen to be in Lake County at the moment, but I could be anywhere, and you could be anywhere. In fact, we don't even know where you are. You tell us where you are, but we don't know that. Of course, you know, we've already checked on you, and your phone didn't respond properly. the point is we're not knowledgeable and not ready to think about the amount of transportation resources that we'd like to use. My family's scattered all over this country. Your family's probably scattered all over this country as well. And transportation, particularly as we get older, if it could be easier, we'd do it more often. So instead, I have to drive I-65 to Mobile.
Thank you.
Hey, Morton, I have a question. I've been
Yes.
looking at some demographic figures for Nappanee and Wakarusa because I'm interested.
Sure.
And what I've come up with, the latest demographics are based on 2019 figures. The census will probably show some difference.
Sure.
But the median age here in Nappanee and Wakarusa, exactly the same, is 35 years old.
Young.
So we have in Nappanee and Wakarusa a population under the age of 20 that constitutes 30% of our residents.
Mhm.
So it seems to me the stimulus package with the ability to do a child tax credit is going to be very much needed here on a humanitarian basis. Female heads of families, families in Nappanee and Wakarusa constitute on average 72% of all households.
Mhm.
But female heads of families are close to 20%. So there has got to have been during this pandemic year, it seems to me, an awful lot of suffering in families which are headed by women as head of family. And surely many of those, of that 30% of the population younger than 20 is also very much in need of some assistance. So from my point of view, I hope to heck this package gets passed without a whole lot of resistance. And I think it's going to be very, very good for our residents here in this corner of Elkhart County and no doubt elsewhere. So
So